So before we look at the Berry ratio and things, let's just look at the P&L so we get things into perspective. Here's your P&L. You've got revenue, you've got gross sales, you take out all the commissions and excise duties, you end up with net sales. Then you deduct from that the cost of goods sold. If you make stuff, how much does it cost to make it? If you buy stuff and resell it, how much did I pay for it? And then how much have I sold it? So that's my COGS. And then you come to your OPEX, your SG&A expenses, which is your operational expenses, which means OPEX is stuff that are not related typically to costs, right? If I have a store, I'm going to have to pay for the store no matter how much I sell. So that is an OPEX, right? If I have personnel, I'm going to have to pay for the personnel no matter whether I make my sales or not. So many companies would put that into OPEX, although you could argue if these are salespeople, maybe I should put some of them into the COGS, but that depends on what you want your P&L for you to do. And then you get down to depreciation, amortization, and then you get your EBITDA and your EBIT, as you can see here. Now the CUP method looks typically at sales only. Yeah, you compare the stuff that you sell to what someone else sells or what you sell to an unrelated party, and you do that either on a gross sales basis or a net sale basis. That's a CUP. So it looks at the top of the P&L. If you look at the resale price method and the cost plus method, they don't go lower down gross profit, basically. Not quite true for cost plus, but we'll get to that in a moment. So you take your gross profit and you divide that, for instance, by your revenue, or you take your gross profit and you say, you know, if I look at other companies, if they sell for 1,000 and they have gross profit of let's say 300 at the end of the day, then you know there is clearly what you need to do in terms of selling stuff intercompany to me is you need to do it in such a way that after I deduct my COGS from my sales, that I should also have 300 or I should have 30% in terms of my margin here, right? And then you get to cost plus. Now the problem with cost plus is you typically sell services, not goods, so you don't have COGS. You only have OPEX. You have all these services that you need to provide. So for the cost plus, you look at your total OPEX, and then you would say, okay, well, if I spend 100, how much would I like to make on my EBIT line? Maybe I would like to make 10. So then I need to sell my stuff for 100 plus 10 is 110, right? Or I should make at least a 10% profit on my costs, and that is what gives you the cost plus. Now, I'm not sure if the TNMM was around at that time, but the TNMM would then say, no, we're going to look further down the P&L. We're not going to stop at gross profit. We're going to stop at EBITDA, or we're going to stop at EBIT. And the reason is just because things become a little more predictable. You know, if you've got a positive gross profit margin, you can still be loss making, and it'll get you into trouble with the tax authorities. If you've got a positive EBIT margin, chances of you being loss making become a lot less. So that's a pragmatic answer. The second practical answer is that it's very difficult to find the gross profit margins of companies. They don't always publish it, and if they do publish it, the division of costs between COGS and OPEX is for a large extent voluntary, depending on what you want your P&L to do. You could, as I said before, put your salespeople into COGS if you really want to calculate your gross profit margin based on that. But you could also put them into your OPEX. So when you're comparing yourself with other companies, you will need to be very, very clear about whether they've put their costs in the same category, COGS or OPEX, if you're going to use a gross profit margin. However, if you're using a operating profit margin, it doesn't matter, because you know whether it's COGS or whether it is OPEX, it's still included in your numerator when you look at your margin. And then we come to the Berry ratio, and the Berry ratio is different, right? Because what the Berry ratio does is it takes your OPEX. Let me rephrase that. It takes your gross profit and it divides it by your OPEX, right? So you will always have a number bigger than 1 unless you're loss making. And the reason why it does this is because Berry said, you know what, you're providing a service And I don't care what you sell, how much that costs. What you're doing is you're selling stuff. You're not making stuff. So I'm not interested in the COGS. I'm interested in how much it costs you to do the sales. And obviously the more it costs you, the more your reward, your expected reward should be. And that's why I'm going to look at gross profit. I'm not going to look at revenue, because then you still have the COGS playing a role in there. And I'm simply going to divide the gross profit by your OPEX. And this is the way it looks on the P&L. So let us now go through what the court said about the IRS approach and about the Berry ratio and everything. And then I'll take you through what Berry himself wrote about this case. So the court said the plaintiff contends that the commissioner's results do not conform to any of the specific methods under regulations and is therefore unreasonable per se, right? Because in the US, they've got to show that if the commissioner's adjustment is unreasonable, then it gets thrown out. But the court then says, but the regulations specifically allow for another appropriate method, right? And that's what they've done. They've done a fourth method. Well, I guess what we would today call a sixth method, or another method, or the OECD calls another method after, besides the five. You know, they've done another method and the regs allow for it. DuPont has not convinced us on this record that the commissioner abused the broad discretion he possessed, or that he acted unreasonably, because that's what DuPont had to show. They had to show that the commission acted unreasonably. And then we get to the first of the IRS's defenses, and that is where the Berry ratio comes in. On the contrary, two economic indices presented by the defendant, that is the IRS, support the result of the Commission's reallocation. One index compares DISA's ratio of gross income to total operating costs. So that's a Berry ratio that we just saw there, but it gets into more detail, and we look at that when we get to Berry's article. And it compares that with the ratios of 32 advertising management consultants and distributor firms, functionally similar in general to DISA. These are the result. The average gross income of the 6 management firms, 108%. The 5 advertising firms, 123.9%. The 21 distributors, 129%, okay, and then you get to DISA, 281% for 1959 and 397% for 1960, and then the court says about the 285 figure, the 281.5% figure for 1959, if readjusted to exclude one-time startup costs, would be over 336%. So that is quite far from the so-called comparables, right? And then the second was, in fact, a return on assets. The second index does not rely at all on general functional similarities, but rests solely on a very comprehensive study of the rates of return on assets of over 1,100 companies. After reallocation, DISA's return on capital would be better than over 99 after reallocation. This is after reallocation done by the IRS. DISA's return on capital would still be better than over 96% of the 1,133 companies surveyed, is what they said. So clearly, even after adjustment, you know, the IRS was reasonable, and the court therefore concludes, whatever the general limits of any particular gauge of industry profitability, plaintiff cannot escape the basic thrust of defendant's proof. Defendant, the IRS, has shown that DISA made extraordinarily high profits, which the commissioner reallocated to an economically reasonable level. And let's see how that was done. So what Berry did is he split out the three groups that DuPont itself said was comparable, right? And so there were companies providing market research and management consulting. There were companies providing advertising, and then where the Berry ratio really comes in, there were companies providing distribution services, right? And for the market and research, I mean, this is what Berry wrote. He says, in the first instance, I compared DISA's gross profit from the resale of DuPont products divided by DISA's total operating costs. So gross profit means you cut out COGS. In other words, I consider DISA to have been paid an amount for its services equal to the total resale margin granted by its parent. I then asked what that translated to in terms of a markup on the operating costs of that DISA incurred. That markup was 282% of the operating expense in 1959 and 397% in 1960. The total receipts of the 6 market research management consulting firms over a 5-year period averaged 108% of their total expenses. So this simply doesn't work, right? If you then look at advertising agencies, I looked at the ratio of billed commissions to total operating costs, again excluding the cost of placement on the grounds that the cost of placement is a measure of the services provided by the media, not by the advertising agency. So what he means here is the advertising agency say, let's do it this way, let's do it this way, and let's look like this, and then we'll put it on TV, we'll put it on the radio, we'll put it on newspapers. Now he took out the cost for putting it on radio, putting it on TV, and putting it on newspapers. At the time, advertising agencies typically billed clients at the rate of 15% of the cost of placement. So kind of a cost plus 15, I guess, is what we come to. And then he deals with distribution. And he says, to complete the story, I then compared DISA's experience with that of 21 independent distributors. Here, however, the measure in each case was the ratio of gross profit, less interest and extraneous income to operating costs. In other words, let's take only the costs that are relevant. This is a measure that has since become known as the Berry ratio. The Berry ratio for these 21 distributors averaged 1.37. So if you divided their operating profit, their gross profit by their OPEX, it was 1.37. In contrast, with the DISA Berry ratios of 2.82 and 3.97, right? DISA realized operating margins on operating costs of 182 and 287%, whereas the corresponding profit margin realized by the independent distributors averaged 37%. So it was almost 5 times to 10 times higher, to 8 times higher than the distributors. And he concludes by saying the Berry ratio is nothing more than the cost plus method applied to a distributor where the cost of goods sold is deliberately excluded because that cost does not reflect anything that the firm itself does. It's about what the distributor does. It's not about what the manufacturer did to make the product that the distributor is distributing. That was the case that I wanted to discuss this week with you. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed revisiting it. I always learn from it when I look at it. Bye for now.